Hi everyone, and welcome to the very first Shane Plays D&D Rules Crawl, which is exactly like a dungeon crawl, except completely different. I'll basically be taking D&D rules discussions and clarifications and trying to go a little bit deeper and kind of clarifying them or whatever, and kind of taking a look at these discussions, usually from people either that work at D&D or are very knowledgeable about D&D, and just kind of going over a few at a time. I hope you find this helpful, both as a DM or as a player. And I've actually been wanting to get to this video series for a long time, but I haven't had the time. And so I don't know when I'll do my next one. I'm just kind of playing around this week. This past week, I wasn't able to run my Out of the Abyss session, which I normally could make a video out of. So this freed me up a little bit to experiment with this kind of video. I don't know when I'll do my next one. It'll just depend on do people like it? Is it helpful? Do I enjoy doing it? That sort of thing. And also, I don't push this very often, but I do have a Patreon under Shane Plays, and the more support I get there, frees me up from doing like freelance work for other stuff to do this kind of thing. So, I try not to be like, oh, you got to support my Patreon to get content. But if you want more content, that's a good way to encourage me for this kind of thing. Now I'll keep doing my other videos, but this particular series will probably depend on time, Patreon, whether people like it and stuff like that. But enough of all that. One thing I want to say is I recommend that you follow, if you're not already, there's a guy, Zoltar, Sage Advice, and it's not the Sage Advice that Wizards of the Coast does with, almost kind of like Unearthed Arcana kind of, well, not Unearthed Arcana, they do rules clarifications, and they do have an Unearthed Arcana, but they have like a rules clarifications or whatever, and they call it Sage Advice. This is actually a person who runs a website at sageadvice.eu, I think, and then also has a, let me look this up here real quick, the website is sageadvice.eu, yeah, and there's a Twitter at Sage Advice D&D. And I would recommend that you follow those. Some of the stuff that I've been collecting, I have a whole list of rules clarifications I want to get through. Some of it I just see because I follow, people in the D&D and RPG world, but a lot of it I see because of Zoltar puts it out. So, and brings it to my awareness, or my attention. So if you like this kind of thing, I definitely recommend that you follow sageadvice.eu or Sage Advice D&D on Twitter. So that being said, let's dig into the first rules discussion here, and it comes down, this is from Jeremy Crawford. You're probably going to see some whitewashing on me real quick here as let me put on my spectacles of D&D rules crawling. In my other videos, they're spectacles of viewer feedback +3. These are +3 spectacles of D&D rules crawling. So this comes down to the natural 20. This is the natural 20 or the fumble of the 1, rolling a 20 on a 20-sided dice, or a 1 has for decades, really almost since the beginning of the hobby, been a special roll. And normally it's a crit on a 20, which means something amazing happens or you do double damage or whatever. And on a 1, it's usually called a fumble. And it's either, you just miss or something worse happens, like you drop your sword, or you break whatever, or you fall off the cliff if you're trying to be stealthy, whatever, something. And Jeremy Crawford has clarified here that in D&D 5e, and I'm sure in other editions as well, I didn't go look, that it on an ability check, if you're doing like a stealth or persuasion or listen or spot, that 20, that automatic crit or automatic fumble thing on a 20 or 1 does not apply to ability checks. Now most DMs and parties and groups that I know of, including mine, don't play it that way. I house rule it so that a natural 20 or a 1 on an ability check or a non-attack roll or whatever is still considered, automatic amazing success or automatic embarrassing kind of failure. But by the rules for D&D, the only thing that the 1 or 20 on a D20 applies to is if you're making an attack roll or a death saving throw. That's it. The other saving throws that you might be making, or ability rolls or whatever, by the rules. Now there's rules as written, which is raw, and then there's rules as interpreted, which is RAI, and you get a little wiggle room there, or you can just flat out say I'm going to house rule it. But by the book, by the rules, it's not an automatic failure if you make an ability check or just a regular saving throw or whatever, and and you roll a 1 on a D20 or 20, it's not an automatic success or an automatic failure. So that will probably surprise a lot of people, because it's so common in D&D and even some other games for critical successes and critical fumbles to apply to just any type of check. But again, by the book, that's not the case. Now, the next clarification I want to come to here is also from Jeremy Crawford. Now, remember that Jeremy Crawford is he is like the rules lead for, D&D lead designers, Mike Merles and Jeremy Crawford. And I'm looking at the Player's Handbook here. And then the Player's Handbook lead was Jeremy Crawford. So if if people are like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about, well, I kind of think he does. I mean, you can still debate with him or whatever, but I think he's interpreting the rules that, as they're written. And he'll even sometimes in his tweets say, look, you can do whatever you want, but rules as written is this. Now, the next question that I want to go into here, and it kind of relates to rolling a 20 or rolling a 1 or whatever on an attack roll, is somebody asked, Mavalanche on Twitter asked Jeremy Crawford about a magic missile attack. And it also said, or does that apply, because, or is that even a point, because is magic missile not an attack? And Jeremy Crawford came back and said, magic missile is not an attack. Okay, and it led to this whole, and I'll put the links to these discussions in the video notes. It led to this whole people basically arguing with Jeremy Crawford and basically saying, well, you're throwing a spell at somebody and doing damage. I would call that an attack. Well, yes and no. Okay, so philosophically, by the normal use of the word, yeah, if I throw a spell, blam, and hit you and hurt you, I have attacked you. But by the rules, there is what's called an attack roll, and that's what we're talking about here. There's a lot of stuff rules wise that triggers if you're making an attack roll. And an attack roll, this starts on page 193 in the Player's Handbook, says whether you're striking with a melee weapon, firing a weapon at range, or making an attack roll as part of a spell. And then it goes on and talks about the attack roll. Roll this, add your bonuses, whatever, compared to armor class, et cetera, and it hits or it doesn't. But what Jeremy Crawford is saying here, because if you look at the magic missile spell on page 257, there's no attack roll. It's instantaneous. It's one action. Each dart hits a creature of your choice, and no, darkness is not a creature, so you can't cast magic missile with the darkness. So it's not an attack roll. It's not an attack in the technical sense of the rules. Any spell or whatever that automatically hits, or something that happens automatically without rolling an attack die or making an attack roll with a d20, is not technically an attack in D&D. And that's important to know, because, there's some other stuff says, if an attack is successful, or if this or that or whatever, then all this stuff starts triggering. So it's important to know what is an attack and what's not. And casting magic missile, which you don't make an attack roll, is not technically an attack in combat. It's casting a spell that has an instant, an automatic result. So that's thing there. And this stuff, you'd sit back and you go, wow, I never thought of it that way. But if you have a deeper understanding of the rules, then you'll get a deeper ability to apply those rules. If you think of the rules as a set of principles, And then once you know those principles and how they work and interact together, then you can apply them to multiple situations without needing to know, every, like having a 800 page, book on every possible scenario that could ever possibly come up. So, and that's a lot of what the D&D people I see when they're answering questions online or whatever, they try to take things back to the basic principle. Like, was this an attack? Well, let's look at what an attack roll is rather than addressing that specific situation. What's an attack roll? Does what you're asking about qualify? Well, then it's not an attack roll. I mean, something still happens, but it's not technically an attack roll. Okay, so the next clarification here, or the next two clarifications actually involve counterspell. And somebody asked, again, Jeremy E. Crawford on Twitter, said, does counterspell work against wands? And the like, was the question. And then Jeremy Crawford answered, counterspell targets a creature casting a spell, no matter the source of the spell. So if the creature itself is casting the spell, or if it's using an item, or etc., irregardless, it's going to be effective because it's targeting that creature that's casting the spell. So it's not targeting the wand or the ring or the scroll or what have you. So again, we're going back to the basic principle. It's like, look at the spell, which is on page 228 in the player's handbook. And it says, you attempt to interrupt a creature in the process of casting a spell. And then it goes on to talk about how does it work and this and that and the other. So yes, you can counterspell somebody using a wand. Unless for some reason there's an item description that says whatever ability or whatever you're using does not count as a spell. And I guess that's possible. You could run across something like that. But unless it specifically says this isn't considered a spell item, then, you can't, you're fine. You can counterspell that. And then the next question, this was actually directed at Matthew Mercer from Critical Role, who's a very popular DM out there. But he's not officially a rules designer or anything on D&D. Somebody asked Matthew Mercer, can you counter a counterspell? And Matthew Mercer said, this is a good distinction. And I think that he's replying to somebody, I don't know. Anyway, the thread of his discussion here, I feel like maybe one little piece of the conversation got left out. But Matthew Mercer does says, if it's your original spell being countered, I think you couldn't counter the counterspell. And this is what Matt Mercer's saying. So it's like, you're throwing a spell, somebody counters you. How are you going to turn around and then counter their counterspell personally? Unless you have some weird ability to because you're in the middle of casting a spell. And then somebody's trying to counter that. And then while you're casting that, you're suddenly going to cast another spell to counter the counter. So I would say in most situations, you cannot counter a counter spell being cast at you. However, there's nothing that says counter spell in and of itself can't be countered. It's just another spell. Matthew Mercer goes on to say, if a foe counters an ally spell, I'd rule that you could counter that counter spell. And then he goes on to say that's his opinion. Well, I agree with Matthew Mercer's opinion. Let's look at counterspell on I just had it, didn't I? Didn't I just have it? I did looking at it. Counterspell. Yeah, it's simply a spell like any other. And it doesn't say anywhere in the description that this spell cannot be countered. So if there's some sort of situation where somebody casts a spell, somebody else counters it, and then a third party wants to say, I'm going to counter the second counter spell. I guess, if it was allowed, if you could somehow cast counterspell as a reaction or something like that, then, as long as the timing and the rules allowed the spell to be cast at that moment, I don't see why, you couldn't counter somebody else's counterspell while they're trying to counter the original counterspell. Hope that's not too confusing. So anyway, that's it for today. So we talked about natural 20s and natural 1s on ability checks and saving throws and stuff that is not a attack roll or a death saving throw. We talked about what is an attack, specifically using Magic Missile as the example. And then we had a couple of how does Counterspell work, and can Counterspell be countered? So I hope you enjoyed this sort of inaugural pilot video, and hopefully what will be an ongoing series at some point. And you know, I've got a whole lot of these collected, you know, and also feel free to send them in to me, and I will do my best to get them at some point. Again, for the near future, we probably won't see a lot of these, but I will try to get them going as soon as I can, you know, if people get benefit out of it. Thanks so much for watching Shane Plays D&D Rules Delve #1. Please leave a comment, maybe a thumbs up, that helps me out tremendously, and please consider subscribing to the channel. We'll catch you next time on Shane